You're also founder of the Jom Balik Undi campaign. Let's talk a little bit about overseas votes, because after fighting for so long for the right to vote postal votes for overseas Malaysians, it looks like there's only 6,298 Malaysians at the moment out of the 700,000 overseas Malaysians that have signed up for this. Why do you think it's such a dismal number?
Well, let's talk about Jom Balik Undi first. I think the campaign for Jom Balik Undi started actually started in Australia with discussions with some of our friends in Singapore as well as other countries about how we need to encourage the highest voter turnout for Malaysia. So when Jom Balik Undi started, it was more of starting a campaign to encourage local voters, people actually living in the country, to come out and vote. I mean, how good would it be if you can say to a friend, hey, look, you just live in Bangsa, why don't you just go and vote at the your polling stations at the school like 10 minutes away, because I have a cousin who's coming back from Switzerland to vote, and you're taking your vote for granted even though you're living in the country. I mean, it's too hot, it's leceh lah and things like that, So there was a lot of apathy in the last elections. I had breakfast with Ibrahim Sufyan from Merdeka Centre just the other day, and the area where, for example, in Lucky Gardens all the way to Bukit Bandaraya, for example, in the last elections, the voter turnout was about 50%. So that's dismal for an urban area. So yeah, there's a lot of apathy in the country. Even though the elections this is the most talked about elections. It's been 2-3 years.
So all talk, no action. Is that what
so
you're afraid of?
There's this fear of we still need this high voter turnout. There is concern that there may be there probably is some discrepancies in the voter the electoral roll, and there's also concern that there will be cheating, wide-scale cheating. So the only way we can mitigate all this is to encourage more people to come back. Another block of voters which we were encouraging to come back, which we were targeting, were the Malaysians living in Singapore. Now that's, I think, from some of the things I've read, probably about 400,000 Malaysians work in Singapore. Now if we can encourage just half of that number to return, that's 200,000 voters. That will swing the election one way or the other, because they are not all living in urban areas. Some of them will be voting in various constituencies. So that might make a big difference.
But why come home to vote when there's already an option for postal voting?
Yes, as I said earlier, the campaign started before the announcement came from the EC. The EC announced the mechanism for postal voting on January 21st. Now, on January 21st, even the initial sort of press release the EC the EC made, it wasn't really clear how we will be able to lodge the postal vote. There were concerns by the diaspora activist groups, including Global Bersih, including My Overseas Vote, about how safe would this ballot be? I mean, will it be secure? How would you know if your vote will not be manipulated and things like that? So because of the uncertainty, Global Bersih as well as My Overseas Vote released an advisory encouraging Malaysians overseas to come back to vote in person if they're registered voters. Another thing is the news coverage on this overseas voting issue it's been a bit disappointing that the EC has taken a very judgmental tone about 750,000 Malaysians overseas, and some of these groups have said that there are so many Malaysians overseas and all of them are willing to vote, but only about 6,000 have registered, and it's been repeated week after week. I mean, you keep hearing this that Malaysians overseas are apathetic. Our initial the assumptions were true that they're apathetic, but that's not really true. I think when you actually look and scrutinize at the forms, they require they require the applicant to actually state how many days they have been in Malaysia in the last 5 years. Now, when we look at our passport system, we have the new passport with the microchip, and we don't actually have a stamp on the passport saying that you've exited Malaysia, entry to Malaysia, and things like that. So, if you don't keep your ticket stubs, how are you going to know which days you're in Malaysia? I mean, I was living in Australia for 8 years, and I recently came back in January. Now, in the 8 years, I would come back to Malaysia every year, but as part of that, maybe 2-week or 3-week holiday, a week would be spent in Singapore visiting friends, or a week would be spent in China or in Thailand or something like that. So, of that time I spent in Malaysia, I mean, I don't know how many days I'll be spending in Malaysia in the last 5 years. I can't have. There's no way for me to track.
So what you're saying is that there's concern that the process itself is not credible or not trustworthy, and also the process is too complicated?
All I'm saying is I'm quite amazed that 6,000 people actually registered through this process, because it's either their record keeping or of the 750,000 Malaysians overseas, I think the 6,000 actually got in would have like perfect record keeping. They know exactly where they were in the last 5 years, and how many days cumulatively they were in Malaysia.
But let's say there's 6,000 people who've already signed up for this. What about the other 744,000 that probably have not?
First of all, the requirements were that you have to be a voter first. You have to be a registered voter first before you can register to be an overseas voter. Now, that's an impediment on the outset, because many Malaysians who have left overseas, they left before they were... I left Malaysia before I was 21. Now, if I decided to stay on, I did decide to stay on in Australia, and if I decide not to register to vote when I come back for this, registering to vote is not the priority.
Right.
So, not all Malaysians who have left would have
registered voters.
Registered.
Okay.
So this is a youth demographic. So I'm talking about the young demographic, that my peers who are overseas, not all of them would have the opportunity to register as voters. And in that sense, without that initial registration, they'll be disenfranchised anyway. And that's disappointing, because there was no mechanism by the EC to register ordinary voters overseas. There was a mechanism to register first-time student voters, voters or students from overseas, in the old regulations, where full-time students could register as voters. Yeah, so that's disappointing that they've harped on this issue.
Okay, well, let's hope that more Malaysians come home to vote then.
Indeed, I'll give you some numbers. I think AirAsia has run a campaign. AirAsia X has run a campaign for long-haul flights. 1,000 have signed up. About 1,000 have signed up for that. I think they're returning through that channel. Many others have booked their bus tickets. There's a carpool campaign from Singapore, which is encouraging. So we'll see if we get that 200,000 voters from overseas.
Right, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.